Obersalzberg in the summer of 1939. Private photographs from Eva Braun's collection. At the Berghof, Adolf Hitler's mistress determined who belonged to the inner circle around the dictator and who did not. After the Nazis came to power, the Führer surrounded himself in his free time primarily with followers who owed him their careers. The company at the Berghof also included Hitler's closest associates and their wives, as well as secretaries and personal aides.
After 1933, after he was actually appointed Reich Chancellor, Obersalzberg continued to be his retreat. But now the circle surrounding him there changed. There was a lot of money. Basically, anything was possible. There was little morality, to put it that way, and the idea was, we rule the world, and we're allowed to do anything.
The daily routine at the now completely isolated Obersalzberg was almost always the same. Hitler was a late riser. After lunch, he liked to go for walks with visitors. The company was hand-picked and unconditionally devoted to the dictator. Anyone who did not constantly prove his loyalty was removed from the inner circle. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop was one of those particularly assiduous yes-men.
Nobody in the inner circle around Hitler were there by chance. They were mostly people he had known for a long time, people who had relationships with confidants. And Wilhelm Brückner was someone who had proven himself to be absolutely loyal and also capable. He was a good organizer and a very central figure in the inner circle until 1940.
The personal adjutant and bodyguard was almost always in the vicinity of the dictator. Hitler trusted him, and Wilhelm Brückner enjoyed his special position in the court. The Führer appreciated the blonde giant's good manners and organizational skills. Brückner was one of those who controlled access to Hitler. His rise was typical for the circle around the dictator.
As far as we know today, Wilhelm Brückner got into the inner circle and Hitler through Ernst Röhm. He is also a figure who is often overlooked, who was already moving in Hitler's inner circle in 1922. He was the SA leader in Munich and basically organized security for all Hitler's appearances. He was the one who commanded the SA in Munich.
Brückner rose to become Hitler's right-hand man in 1930 after Ernst Röhm returned from Bolivia, where he had been temporarily hired as a military advisor. After the Nazis took power, the SA Chief of Staff left no doubt that he wanted a share of the power. In March 1933, the Munich faithful awaited the arrival of the Reich Chancellor at the Riem airfield. Even when Hitler was traveling by plane, Wilhelm Brückner was part of the entourage. During the flight, he sat in one of the back rows so that he could be on hand whenever the dictator wanted something. On arrival in Munich, Brückner got off the plane shortly after the dictator. His loyalty now belonged entirely to his boss. For Hitler, the so-called time of struggle was over. Many of the old comrades in arms were now losing influence. The existence of the Führer's mistress was hidden from the public. Only at Obersalzberg could Eva Braun play her role quite freely. Officially, she acted as a housekeeper. Her secret love affair with Hitler was not a problem there. Wilhelm Brückner also liked to present himself at the Berghof as a fun-loving man who was always ready for shenanigans. The adjutant was actually married, but was attracted to young women, to whom he pretended he was a bachelor.
In fact, you have to imagine that morality, especially sexual morality, was very lax. There was actually hardly anyone who didn't have extramarital affairs, and that included Wilhelm Brückner.
Brückner was quite clearly a ladies' man. At the Berghof, he often had his longtime lover Sophie Storck with him, an artist from Munich who also belonged to the inner circle. When the chief adjutant dumped Eva Braun's girlfriend and married a younger woman in 1937, Hitler was furious. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "Bruckner got married in Baden-Baden, but the Führer did not even congratulate him. He is sharply against this marriage, which is a true abnormality. He is 53, she 18 years." Whether the bride knew Bruckner's dark secret is unclear. The husband literally had a skeleton in the closet, a death that has not been solved to this day and that only became known 70 years later. "22-year-old Gerda Sommer probably met Wilhelm Bruckner, who was almost 30 years her senior, at a Berlin nightlife venue. The daughter of a bank clerk, she regularly sought acquaintances with well-heeled men there. On June 5, 1934, Gerda Sommer and Wilhelm Bruckner returned from a trip to the Baltic Sea. 2 days later, her body was discovered.
In 1934, the body of a young woman was indeed found in Bruckner's apartment, a friend he had met weeks before, and whose death and the circumstances of that death he actually covered up.
The only known photo of Gerda Sommer. When Wilhelm Bruckner entered his apartment on June 7, 1934, he found the body of the fun-loving blonde lying on his bed. The police were not called until the next day.
The parents were informed too late, basically not until a day later. A corpse lay in Wilhelm Bruckner's apartment for 24 hours. The parents later tried through acquaintances to contact Bruckner again and again, and the Reich Chancellery in general, to find out what had happened and whether their only daughter might have been murdered. So here you can see how things were done in Hitler's inner circle.
In the Reich Chancellery, the death came at an inopportune time, because in precisely those days, the assassination of Ernst Röhm, the former patron of Bruckner, was being planned. There had not to be a dead girl on his bed, no matter whether she was murdered or had committed suicide. Gerda Sommer was buried a few days later in a cemetery outside Berlin, without the cause of death being officially determined.
For Wilhelm Bruckner, it was indeed a precarious situation in 1934. In June 1934, it looked as if they were just about to disempower Ernst Röhm to smash the SA. Bruckner was a close friend of Röhm. He himself belonged to the SA, and the fact that a dead girl had now been found in his apartment could also become a problem for him.
Under its chief of staff, the SA had meanwhile developed into a state within the state, and Ernst Röhm controlled the paramilitary organization like an autocrat, to the annoyance of the Reichswehr. Hitler decided to eliminate his companion. On June 30, 1934, he personally arrested his former friend and had him shot in his cell the next day. Shortly thereafter, the dictator traveled to Bayreuth, as he did every year. When Winifred Wagner asked her, Wolf, about the murder and the accompanying bloody purges, Hitler replied that only 77 people had been executed who had allegedly planned a coup against him. Röhm had violated the commandment of loyalty and could not be saved. Winifred Wagner accepted her friend's explanation and would remain loyal to him all her life.
After the murder of Röhm, the clearing of Obersalzberg began, and Hitler no longer surrounded himself with the old patrons, with the old friends, who had basically experienced him as a limp sausage during the time of his rise. He surrounded himself with a new circle of people who owed their careers entirely to him, along with their social advancement in the world.
Rare photos show the extensive construction work on Obersalzberg in the mid-1930s. The small house Wachenfels was integrated into the plans for a more representative residence, from which the dictator could conduct government business. Hitler's Berghof, with its huge panorama window, was created. In order to be the centerpiece of the area, the surrounding properties were expropriated, or their owners were forced to sell. Martin Bormann threatened anyone who refused to part with their house with a concentration camp. The former farmhand from Thuringia had come a long way since the Nazis came to power. First as chief of staff to Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess, and finally as an organizer and factotum at Obersalzberg.
Bormann was 100% devoted to him. He was unscrupulous, endlessly industrious. He worked insanely hard. He had an incredibly good memory, and he also made great use of his position in his own way. There is this quote from him: "No one comes to the Führer except through me." So to speak, he also performed his function as Cerberus magnificently, and he did what Hitler could not. Hitler was, after all, everything, but not a systematic desk worker.
Bormann also took care of Hitler's financial affairs and in this way secured his long-term position in the court. He was regarded as a flawless National Socialist who mercilessly pursued traitors to the cause and relentlessly implemented all of his master's orders. "What or who benefits the movement is good," he declared. "Whoever harms it is a pest and my enemy." He got into the closest environment of the Führer through marrying the right woman. With his family, Bormann lived in a house not far from the Berghof, whose owner had also been forced to sell. Gerda Bormann had already given her husband 6 children and was an ardent supporter of Hitler, as well as a convinced anti-Semite who believed that she belonged to a superior master race. Her husband maintained a friendly relationship with Eva Braun, who admired the radicalism of the Bormann couple. Gerda was the daughter of Walter Buch, the highest party judge of the NSDAP. In 1929, she married Martin Bormann, with Adolf Hitler as best man.
The fact that Hitler repeatedly appeared as best man to his closest comrades in arms shows how close the relationships were, that these were friendships, that these were human ties and relationships. Here was not a leader who stood apart from his entourage, but this was a community. He was part of a community. And this was evident in the fact that private relationships were cultivated, that a great deal was written, that a great many pictures were taken. These were basically family gatherings.
This was also the case in 1935, when Hitler's second-in-command, Hermann Göring, married the actress Emmy Sonnemann. As the First Lady of the Reich, Mrs. Göring assumed representative duties and received heads of state and diplomats at the Karin-Hall country estate. The Görings also owned a large house on Obersalzberg, but there was hardly any private contact with Hitler and his court. Although the estate was not far from the Berghof, Emmy Göring never met Eva Braun in person. To the chagrin of Hitler's entourage, the corpulent Göring was popular with the Germans, who even forgave him his eccentric lifestyle.
Komm, ja, mein Cäsar. Kommst du mich besuchen? Mucki, komm. Sind ordentlich satt geworden, Cäsar. Los, schön, spring, hopp.
In the course of the 1930s, fewer and fewer supporters and friends who had promoted Hitler's rise were able to gain access to the Führer's inner circle. One exception was Joseph Goebbels, who was also a welcome guest at the Berghof. He had no personal ambitions and was unconditionally loyal. Although Goebbels was married, he repeatedly had extramarital affairs. Finally, the minister fell in love with the Czech actress Lida Barova. His wife threatened to divorce him. Joseph Goebbels had married Magda Quandt in 1931. Hitler was obviously particularly attracted to her. When the marriage crisis came to a head in 1938, the Führer took Magda's side.
Magda Goebbels was also a convinced National Socialist. She got on very well with Hitler, which is why he stood up for her. And I think Magda Goebbels was really relatively close to him. I mean, the wives of Hess and others played a not entirely unimportant role in this society. There are also some who say that Hitler became involved because of this. It was the time of the Munich Agreement, and therefore particularly inappropriate for Goebbels to go off with a Czech woman of all people. He was a great womanizer in other respects as well.
In the world of film stars, the minister was known behind closed doors as the Babelsberg Buck. For years, Magda Goebbels had put up with her husband's love affairs for the sake of her position and her children. But now, she travelled to Hitler in Berchtesgaden and asked him for help. Goebbels was summoned to the Berghof.
Here's this minister of propaganda with his 6 children and his wife, and Hitler didn't want that to disintegrate just like that suddenly there's such a whoremonger among them, so to speak, who's constantly running after other women, and to just let this model family disintegrate. I would guess that this was his motivation. He had relatively good contact with Magda Goebbels, and her husband was very important to him. After all, the Minister of Propaganda was crucial to the stability and self-expression of the regime in many situations. He simply wanted to stabilize the whole situation.
Hitler put his foot down. Goebbels complied and ended the affair. Magda had prevailed, and she repaid the Führer with fanatical loyalty to the death. After they had murdered their 6 children, Magda and Josef Goebbels committed suicide in 1945, just like Hitler and Eva Braun. The amateur films shot on Obersalzberg suggest a relaxed private life in which politics played no part. After the fall of the Third Reich, this was exactly what the survivors of the court would claim.
In Hitler's Umfeld gab es nie.
In Hitler's environment, there was never any difference between political and private life. There was no one in the court who had not been involved. There was no one in the court who had not also been a convict. There were no staff at Obersalzberg. There were no periphery figures in the inner circle around Hitler. Everyone had a function.
After the war, the sworn circle around Hitler naturally had an interest in downplaying their proximity to the dictator. This did not always succeed, as shown by the case of Karl Brandt, the Führer's personal physician. His story is also typical of the rise of a virtual unknown to the immediate vicinity of power, with monstrous consequences.
In the case of Karl Brandt, it is also difficult to determine when he actually met Hitler. His wife Annie Brandt had known Hitler since the mid-1920s. She was a well-known swimming champion in Germany, having won championships and trophies and being almost a public figure in her own right. And Hitler had been in contact with her.
Annie Brandt was on vacation in Italy with Eva Braun's family. Hitler's mistress had travelled south with her mother Fanny and sister Gretel. A few girlfriends were allowed to accompany them. Gretel Braun had been part of the inner circle for years, just like Annie Brandt. Under her maiden name Annie Reborn, she was a successful athlete in the 1920s, winning 8 German championships in swimming. At the European Championships in 1927, she won the bronze medal with the relay team. At this time, she was already in close contact with Hitler.
A friendship developed not only with Annie Reborn, as she was then called, but also with her family. And after Annie Brandt then met her later husband, Karl, it is very likely that Karl Brandt also met Hitler within this Reborn family.
The handsome surgeon joined the SS for the sake of his career and eventually became Hitler's doctor. He shared with his patient the perverse conviction that killing the terminally ill was inevitable. In Mein Kampf, Hitler had already claimed that a physically healthy person was more valuable than a weak-minded weakling. Now he planned the destruction of those unworthy of life.
Hitler's ambition was always to appear unassailable, and of course this also included not being seen as directly involved in assassinations. That's why he always surrounded himself with his inner circle, which needed little convincing. He was surrounded by a circle of already convinced people. It was the same with the euthanasia program. Hitler was, of course, and this had already been made clear in Mein Kampf, that he held very clear convictions that, in his opinion, the sick, the disabled, must not be allowed to reproduce. And this opinion was shared by the people in his circle.
Since coming to power, the Nazis had put their radical ideological delusions into practice. In such inflammatory films, the propaganda branded mentally or physically disabled people as outsiders to the national community. For years, thousands of helpless victims were forcibly sterilized on the orders of the authorities. After the start of the war, the plan for a secret euthanasia program matured.
A foundation of National Socialism was anti-Semitism and the idea of a healthy, what they considered healthy, a healthy nation. Anything sick, anything disabled should just not be a part of it, should basically be killed, eliminated. Karl Brandt was also convinced that euthanasia was a good concept. But this was a majority opinion in the inner circle. Hitler was not alone in holding those views. Karl Brandt and Philipp Buhler organized the euthanasia. Hitler himself, of course, was never represented as the murderer.
Only reluctantly did Hitler sign a written order that said, "In human judgment, the terminally ill may be granted clemency." As a result, between 1939 and 1941, about 70,000 disabled people were gassed in specially equipped psychiatric institutions and cremated. There is no doubt that Hitler was the driving force behind the murder order. It remains unclear whether it was discussed openly within the inner circle. The close relationship of Karl and Annie Brandt to Hitler and Eva Braun gave rise to the assumption that everyone in the court did, in fact, know about it. While disabled and mentally ill people were being murdered all over Nazi Germany, Karl Brandt was skiing with his wife on the Obersalzberg. In 1945, he was arrested and transferred to Nuremberg.
Karl Brandt
is also someone who stood by this view in the post-war period. He told us quite clearly why it was necessary to form a new national community, to cleanse the national body, as he called it. And a doctor who also interviewed Karl Brandt in Nuremberg at the time later said that Brandt could not distinguish between a human cell and a human being.
In 1946, he was put on trial at the Nuremberg doctors' trial.
In the large jury courtroom at Nuremberg, the first trial against 23 leading National Socialist doctors began. The first day was reserved for the reading of the indictment. It was made by the American chief prosecutor, General Telford Taylor.
Karl Brandt, Siegfried Handlose.
23 defendants faced trial for human experimentation and the murders of hundreds of thousands of innocent people.
Karl Gensken.
Among the offences listed in the indictment were countless murders and atrocities in concentration camps, hospitals and experimental institutions, as well as inhuman medical experiments committed on helpless men and women. Each defendant was called by Chief Justice Beals individually and asked whether he pleaded guilty or not guilty. Karl Brandt, Adolf Hitler's former personal physician, Lieutenant General of the Waffen-SS and Divisional Commissar for Medical and Health Services.
Against you. Guilty or not guilty? Nicht schuldig.
He had entered into a bond for better or worse with Hitler. Brandt defended himself. Euthanasia was not a crime against humanity. The court saw things differently and sentenced him to death. Brandt was executed in 1948. Probably the most controversial figure from Hitler's court was the architect Albert Speer. With his memoirs, bestsellers worldwide in the 1960s and 70s, he shaped a distorted picture of the history of the Third Reich and its dictator for decades, and downplayed his own involvement in the crimes.
Albert Speer always acted in 1945 as if he had come into the circle around Hitler quite by chance, that Hitler had chosen him quite by chance. He had found him sympathetic and then asked him to sit at his table in the Reich Chancellery. The fact is that Speer had been in this environment for a relatively long time. He had been a member of the NSDAP since 1932. When he met Hitler in the course of 1933, he was basically already tried and tested. He had already proved himself to be a convinced National Socialist. And it was only out of this situation that Hitler asked him to come to his table.
The dictator saw himself more as an artist than a politician. And so the young, charismatic Speer had little trouble positioning himself in Hitler's immediate vicinity. With his first commissions, Speer earned the trust of the Führer, and starting in 1934, designed monumental buildings for the party congress grounds in Nuremberg.
Of course, the chemistry was right, but the common interests too. Here was a young architect, something that Hitler had also wanted to build for himself. This idea, we are building a new Reich, also architecturally, that had existed for a long time. And in Speer, he now basically saw someone, a kindred spirit, who could implement those ideas, those wishes.
Contrary to later claims that he was completely apolitical and unaware of the Nazis' racial mania, Speer was a devout disciple of Hitler from the very beginning. His monstrous buildings perfectly reflect the dictator's bizarre fantasies of power. Brutality in stone.
Speer was fascinated, we could say, by the idea of building at that time. Building for a dictator. There were, of course, no limits at all for him. Financially, certainly not. And also otherwise. And the proximity to the dictator was also decisive, of course, for having power within such a system.
Speer and his family moved into a house with a studio on the Obersalzberg, and was thus constantly available for his client. Speer's wife was also a member of the court, and became friends with Eva Braun. Throughout her life, Margareta Speer would not speak out about her husband's entanglements. With the words, "I can't," she once fended off the pressing questions of a Speer biographer. For her husband, proximity to power was a guarantee of money and influence. The children also played their part.
Speer saw to it that he was always in this inner circle. He himself sought contact with Hitler. He himself, of course, also involved his family. That was important for Hitler, to always be part of a family, because he had none himself. And Albert Speer really managed to build up a friendship with Hitler. But not only with Hitler. Speer was also friends with Bormann. And, of course, he was also friends with Karl Brandt. Actually, with everyone in this inner circle.
Although the films and photographs of Eva Braun, especially at Obersalzberg, were supposed to have been destroyed in 1945, part of the collection fell into the hands of the Americans after the end of the war.
These pictures and films from Obersalzberg that we know, The photos after the New Year's Eve meetings, they were not intended for publication. These are private pictures that not only Eva Braun, but everyone who showed up there stuck in their albums. That was something to be proud of, that one belonged to this illustrious circle, to the Führer circle, as Albert Speer once called it, which also served to reassure oneself, of course, but which was also decisive for the cohesion of this circle, its togetherness. We are one. We are a social and political circle. We are working together for a new Germany.
The court was always available. Everyone readily adapted to the daily routine of the Führer and waited for his appearance. Eva Braun played her role as hostess perfectly and organized the private life of her lover. As soon as the dictator entered the picture, everything revolved around him. Political decisions and criminal plans were also discussed.
Everyone in the court was a participant. In Albert Speer's case, we still live from his memories, from his post-war exoneration narratives, in which he made it clear that he had not been involved at all, that he knew nothing at all about the invasion of Austria, and only learned about it from the newspapers. He always learned everything after the fact. He had never been involved, of course not at all in the planning of the wars of aggression. In fact, if we also take pictures seriously as sources, it shows that Speer, just like all the others, were always with Hitler. And he also, for example, on August 22, 1939, when Hitler clearly set out the war aims in front of 50 leading officers in the Berghof, the attack on Poland and also already the announced attack on France and England, not only these officers were present, but also the circle of friends. They were all with him on this day.
Although the dictator's building activities gradually ceased during the war, Speer did not lose his influence, but was even able to increase it. As armaments minister, he had constant access to the Führer's headquarters. Speer organized an army of millions of slave laborers for German industry, also from the SS extermination camps. He claimed to have known nothing about the genocide.
Hitler never sat alone at his table in his headquarters during the war. The man was simply never alone. In the Wolf's Lair, already at the beginning of the war, in the Führer's train, in the evening, at noon, at night, he was always surrounded by his inner circle. Decisions were also made there. Himmler showed up. Bormann took notes. That's basically where the extermination policy was organized. It is completely unbelievable that no one could have heard anything about it.
Albert Speer and Karl Brandt, for example, were present when SS chief Heinrich Himmler and his most important henchmen came to Obersalzberg in August 1939 to discuss the extermination plans in the upcoming Polish campaign. There is also evidence that the genocide of the European Jews was discussed at the Berghof. The court just didn't want to have heard anything about it.
It is quite incredible that Hitler's associates did not know about the Holocaust. None of the comrades in arms, the followers, the friends, could admit after 1945 that they had been part of a murder machinery, that they had known about mass extermination, mass murder. One must also assume, if one actually looks at contemporary letters, that these people at that time had a completely different view of these events, that they were convinced that it was right, that they actually thought that Jews had no business in Germany, that one had to get rid of them somehow. Since they didn't leave voluntarily, they had to be destroyed in some other way.
While Margareta and Albert Speer enjoyed skiing and climbing on the Obersalzberg, the architect's employees evicted Berlin Jews from their apartments or organized building materials for Auschwitz and the other SS death factories on behalf of the armaments minister. The court around Hitler and Eva Braun was complicit in the dictator's crimes against humanity. But anyone who openly addressed the deportations incurred the wrath of the Führer. For decades, photographer Heinrich Hoffmann and his family had been part of Hitler's inner circle. His daughter was married to Baldur von Schirach, the Nazis' Gauleiter in Vienna.
This is a strange story, that Henriette von Schirach, in the summer of 1943 at the Obersalzberg, basically triggered this éclat by addressing Hitler about the fact that Jewish women had been treated badly in Holland, and that she had observed deportations there. In fact, it was her husband himself who had signed the deportation lists, acting as Gauleiter in Vienna. This whole story about Henriette von Schirach and also her husband at the Obersalzberg in 1943 can really only be understood in such a way that here basically the rats were leaving the sinking ship. In the summer of 1943, it was clear to every clear-thinking person, even in Hitler's environment, that the war was actually lost.
After the defeat in Stalingrad, the Führer withdrew almost completely from the public eye. All the more important to him was his court, which now consisted mainly of secretaries, aides, and a few confidants. It also included the hand-picked doctors who treated the now physically ailing dictator on a daily basis.
Karl Brandt said it later, and others, how close they were, that they protected him. They also experienced him in his infirmities, I would say, when he became more and more insecure, while letting himself be injected back to health, so to speak. They experienced his breakdowns.
An aide's notebook says, "We have to protect him. He is unresponsive at the moment, or even understandably depressed because of the war situation. We have to protect him. We have to get his mind off things." While Hitler visibly deteriorated, Albert Speer was on top form as armaments minister. "Speer gets us all drunk with his figures," wrote propaganda minister Goebbels enviously in his diary.
Speer, of course, was also in line. He was actually, in a way, the greatest criminal after Hitler, the one who prolonged the war by 2 years, because he simply whipped up armaments production so brutally and ruthlessly and skillfully that this very war machinery was able to hold out for so long against an enemy that was, after all, several times superior, at least after the United States entered the war.
Along with Josef Goebbels, Albert Speer was now a star of Nazi propaganda. The Home Front and armaments dictator willingly took on the task of delaying certain defeat. They were among the most loyal of the faithful who rallied around the only slightly injured Führer after the failed assassination attempt of July the 20th, 1944.
The conditions in this inner circle at the end of the war were strange to some extent. You can see it after the assassination of Hitler. The reaction in that circle was, what happens to us when he's gone? Not the idea, too bad it didn't work out, and that the misery will finally end. No, they were afraid of what was to come, what kind of world they would end up in once Hitler was gone. What will become of us then? Fear was spreading. Basically, panic was spreading. For better or worse, they were connected to Hitler. They knew that. Karl Brandt knew that. Albert Speer knew that. And that's why they were doing everything they could, even though it was already practically impossible that the war could be won.
In December 1944, Speer personally traveled to the Ardennes to support the last major offensive of the Wehrmacht. Until the end, he repeatedly travelled to Hitler's Reich Chancellery to reaffirm his loyalty. The dictator was determined to end his life in Berlin, and his court stayed with him. Above all, Eva Braun, who wanted to go to her death alongside Hitler. He thanked her shortly before their suicide by marrying her. His last appearance for the newsreels shows a broken man, sending still fanatical youths into the senseless fight. When the end finally approached, he left it up to his closest confidants to leave Berlin or die with him. When Adolf and Eva Hitler were dead, Josef and Magda Goebbels also shot themselves. Martin Bormann died trying to escape the Red Army. The survivors remained a conspiratorial community.
Nach 1945 war es essentiell.
After 1945, it was essential for former comrades in arms, Hitler's associates, to make a distance between themselves and the Nazi system, and from Hitler himself seem credible. And so, basically, the legend of the unapproachable leader, of the Hitler no one had really known personally, whom no one had come close to at all beneath the huge cloak of the leader figure, emerged. Legends arose that Hitler had not really communicated at all, that he only held monologues, that others just sat there, listened to him, were basically completely passive. In fact, however, you can't convince anyone with monologues alone. No one can be convinced by someone who is a complete social incompetent, who cannot develop friendships. It is quite unbelievable. One must indeed distinguish between these post-war narratives of the former comrades in arms, which are, after all, exoneration narratives, which are a tissue of lies, as we know today. Albert Speer lied, Heinrich Hoffmann lied, and yet they are quoted to this day.
Heinrich Hoffmann hat gelogen, und dennoch werden sie bis heute zitiert.
Albert Speer entered the dock at Nuremberg in November 1945. There, the Allies put the leading Nazis on trial. Among them were Hermann Göring, Baldur von Schirach, and Rudolf Hess. Unscrupulous mass murderers, compliant military officers, and pathological anti-Semites. Albert Speer gave the impression that he did not belong there at all. Hermann Göring took over the leadership as a matter of course.
You must plead guilty or not guilty.
Even though Hitler's second-in-command had been stripped of his power for treason. He was sentenced to death and committed suicide in his cell.
Rudolf Hess.
Because of his crazy flight to England, the deputy of the Führer had fallen into disgrace. Albert Speer also joined the phalanx of naysayers. But to the great astonishment of the Nazi bigwigs around Göring, the former armaments minister pursued a strategy all his own. Although he was responsible for the deaths of millions, he shifted the blame onto others and pretended to have reformed. He had prevented something worse and had even wanted to assassinate Hitler, he boldly claimed. He got away with 20 years in prison and, after his release, passed himself off as the good Nazi. The center of Hitler's court lay in ruins in 1945. Most of the files and documents that were kept at the Berghof were destroyed in time by a faithful aide. The evil spirit that emanated from there lived on in the former employees, friends, and confidants. They remained convinced Hitler followers until their deaths.